Good morning, everyone. I think we all are in different time zones. I'm Shobha Arun, one of the co-organizers of the session, and Professor Mariam Sidat is here. She's the chair. She chaired the session yesterday. Professor Wendy Olsen would join us very shortly. I think she's just gone out for a task, but she's going to rejoin us, and I'm sure we'll hear her hello. So a warm welcome to you all from different time zones, be it good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. And I do hope you've been able to enjoy this whole week with a range of sessions that's been organized. So we have an exciting opportunity of working together on this theme of modern slavery. So yesterday we had a fantastic 4 papers, and again today we have the other 4 papers. So I mean, the large themes about the intersection of society and slavery has been brought out through the lens of gender, through migration, through garment sector, and so on. So what today we are going to do is as well look at the next 4 papers. I think we have 3 papers. I think all the speakers are here at least, are representing each paper. So what I'm going to do is to think that we will allot 15 minutes. We will allocate 15 minutes for each paper, and I will set the timer on. So when perhaps, do you want a reminder when it's 3 minutes or 1 minute? What helps you? Because I don't want you suddenly to be alarmed. 1 minute is too short. Does it work for 3 minutes or 1 minute?
Yeah, I think 3 minutes sounds good.
Yeah, okay, 3 minutes is good. So that's the plan. So after we have had our discussion, after we had the 4 papers, we will have question answer. So in the meantime, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, observations in the chat. It'll be great to have the conversation going. And just in terms of netiquette, keep your mic switched off if you're not the speaker, so we don't want disturbances that would constrain the main speaker. And what else? So once we've had the discussion, I just thought we could spend the last 10 minutes, if possible, to speak about publishing plans. So I do hope some of the speakers from yesterday might be able to join us. If not, there will be follow-up emails as well after this. So let's look at the first paper. The first paper is a co-authored paper. So I'm just going to read the co-author's names. So the title of the paper is Reducing Vulnerability to Forced Labor and Trafficking for Women Migrants, a case study on migration pathways from South Asia to the Middle East. There are a couple of authors. So it's Hagar, Savsad, Chloe, Claudia, Nazman and Musna. I think you're all from the IFPRI. Today's presenters would be Hagar and Chloe. Am I right? Yes.
Okay. That's correct.
So I would urge, keep the cameras on. In case we are having an issue, we can switch it off later. It'll be good to see faces. Keep your cameras on, but your mic switched off. But in case, our bandwidth is being affected, then perhaps we could switch our cameras off. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So Hagar and Chloe, it's off to you. So 15 minutes start from now. Handing over to you then.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen so that everyone can see our presentation. Great. Can you all see my screen? And are you seeing the presentation? Great. Okay. Let me just change this view. There we go. Is that viewing the full screen without the presenter notes and so on? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. This paper is a joint effort from a large team. Today, Hagar and I will be presenting on behalf of the team. For those of you who joined yesterday, you saw some of our colleagues, Patrick and Joyce, present their paper. That's part of the same project yesterday. So both these papers are part of a larger project, the Gender Sensitive Risks and Options Assessment for Decision Making, to support the Work and Freedom Phase 2. And today's paper is about reducing vulnerability to forced labor and trafficking of short-term, low-skilled women migrants in South Asia to Middle East corridor. So this corridor has a huge amount of migration, about 10 million migrants a year, and women are well represented in this corridor. About half of these migrants are women. And in this corridor, the Arab states are key destination countries. And in Arab states, the ILO reported that about 40% of both male and female workers in total were migrants. In this pathway, the male migrants mostly work in the construction sector, and female migrants mostly work in the care sector and sometimes in the garment sector. And our study will be focusing on female migrants employed in these two industries, care sector and garment sector. So a brief look at why women migrate in this corridor. There are both push and pull factors. One of the pull factors is high wages for care work and garment work in the Middle East. And this allows migrants to send home huge amounts of remittances. The World Bank estimated that approximately 26% of Nepal's national GDP was accounted for by remittances. And then some of the push factors are challenges that the sending countries face, such as lack of job opportunities or natural disasters or poverty. And this leads women to seek work abroad to try to change their lives, to escape a situation or to increase their freedom or to experience something new. But there is evidence that that women and migrants, and especially women, face vulnerabilities along this pathway that leads to trafficking, forced labor, and exploitation. So to have a quick look at what we consider trafficking and forced labor, the ILO identifies 3 dimensions to forced labor: unfree recruitment, work and life under duress, and impossibility to leave employer. And they consider forced labor to be present if any one of these 3 elements are present. Trafficking relates to migrants' interactions with a network of individuals who organize the migration process, the recruitment brokers, the employment agencies, and the employers. And this relates to elements of deception, coercion, debt bondage, and slavery-like conditions. And then finally, exploitation relates to the restricting of freedom of movement, economic exploitation and violence, or even simply threat of violence. And you'll see that these elements can occur at multiple points on the migration process and may last throughout the entire migration pathway and can improve or worsen through multiple migration cycles. And you'll see throughout the presentation when we talk about some of the experiences of migrants that some of these elements are present in this pathway. So there are many programs that aim to reduce the risk of forced labor and trafficking, especially for migrant women. But we've really found that there's limited research that assesses that work and what works and what doesn't work to prevent forced labor. We found that much of the literature on vulnerability of migrants has been focused on working conditions in receiving countries, in addition to deceptive recruitment practices in countries of origin. And migrants' experiences of forced labor and trafficking transcend these 2 points in time, and a more comprehensive assessment to generate a more realistic portrait of migrant women's experiences as they prepare for migration during the process, in the destination country, and following their return. So in this paper, we draw lessons from the literature, as well as key informants in the field, including academics, development partners, NGO workers, and policymakers, to highlight what are considered the most effective or least effective mechanisms for reducing forced labor and trafficking. So I'm now going to hand over to Hagar to take you through the rest of our presentation.
Thank you, Chloe. So yes, let's walk through these different stages of the migration route and look at the migrant women's experiences throughout, with some bigger themes involved like COVID-19 and the institutional frameworks such as Cafla, which is really unique to the Gulf countries and some of the Arab states. Next, please. Okay, so what is Cafla first? Chloe, can you go to the next slide? So Cafla is, thank you, is a system, is a mix of a system and some normative practices that eventually bind the migrant worker with one employer in the destination. The sponsor is seen as the guardian or the legally responsible person for the worker. So once she arrives, the worker cannot really leave or change her employer without the permission from said employer. And it becomes illegal to remain in the country if she leaves, and subject to deportation. And the system is kind of implemented differently in various countries, and not all of the practices are really what the system entails. Some of them are kind of more like norms that developed over time and became normalized. So in some countries, it's okay to have multiple sponsors, for instance. And one of those norms that became very widespread is that employers or agencies would confiscate passports from the migrant workers and keep them with them throughout the duration. And also recruitment agencies have been normalized. Yeah. Next, please. So first, pre-departure, there's a lot of exploitation that goes on and events that contribute to trafficking, which starts from deception that happens usually from recruitment agencies and brokers who help the migrant woman find a job, like swapping contracts. She would sign a contract and then eventually end up in a very different situation. For example, there's a lot of non-transparency in terms of charges and information. And even though migrant women should not really be burdened with the recruitment costs or the travel costs or any sorts of costs, really what happens is the migrant women often pay a large sum to those agencies, even regardless of whether the employment pays or not. And even those fees have become normalized over time, that it became a cultural expectation that if you're migrating, you have to pay. And some people even believe that the more you pay, the better job you can get abroad. And at the end, what that leads to is debt. And this condition of debt leads to trafficking. And because they borrow a lot of money to be able to pay such fees, from all sorts of places, whether formal or informal, and a lot of the time that comes with really high interest. And so this situation of debt makes it really hard to leave, just to be able to pay the debt. So you have to work through any sort of contract violation, through abuse, scared to be trying to demand their rights or refuse a job and so on. And there's also a lot of financial extortion and sexual harassment that has been reported to take place in documentation sites like paperwork places like visa offices and airports and so on. Next, please. And so some of the mechanisms that we found in the literature, not all of them have been effective as per the literature and our key informants. First, the migration bans, which I think Joyce and Patrick talked about yesterday. Some of these countries, just because of the sheer amount of abuses that have been taking place, just ban women from traveling to work in any of these places, and that actually has been ineffective. What happens is that it endangers women who would not really, that wouldn't kill their will to leave, or so to say, but they would seek an undocumented way or an illegal way. And that puts them at risk more in terms of trafficking. What has been shown to work or be important is pre-departure training, but particularly those trainings that really focus on the awareness of rights and expectations. In general, is some sort of pre-departure training that's usually mandatory in some sending countries, but it's very difficult for women to attend. Usually they're in urban centers and far away and very burdensome to take that trip. So these rates of people of women particularly taking those pre-departure training courses is very low, especially in Nepal. But even with that, the curricula in general has been criticized for being too general, not gender specific, not sector specific, not really comprehensive on the rights and support networks. So it's been recommended that these orientation material should be including the perspectives of women migrants who really know what happened on the ground, or returning migrants. As well as establishing networks pre-departure has been seen as very important. So among fellow women who will be going to the same place to share any sort of information like telephone numbers, addresses of their employers, names of their employers, etc. Especially for women, migrant domestic workers who will most likely be just living with the employer and sometimes with no mobility and no freedom to leave and no access to networks. So next, please. So and then we go to the destination. So a different set of exploitation takes place there, including economic exploitation. So these people, once they go there, a lot of times they do not get their pay. They can get delayed payments for months and months, not getting paid anything. Or they also sometimes get lower payment than what they were promised or what they have in their contract, as well as a lot of racial and gender violence and abuse and just sheer dehumanization that's been really widely reported. Um, and migrant domestic workers in particular barely get any rest or days off, no freedom of movement, usually locked up in the house sometimes, no access to networks, and even garment workers, they are terribly overworked and living in really cramped conditions. And employment agencies are also part of this. So, for example, if the employer discontinues employment
You have 2
with the
minutes.
worker,
2 minutes, Haga.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
I thought we had 20 minutes. Okay.
It was 15, yeah?
Okay. Well, I'm gonna run through this. Thank you. So yeah, next please. So in destination, there have been things that have worked and not. So for example, payment of wages through banks to make sure that they are getting their pay has worked to an extent, but even with penalties, it hasn't been serious enough to work well. But really, research shows that very few workers know how to access support services. So raising their awareness of support services and redress mechanisms is very important. Strengthening embassy presence is important because even some embassies don't have, some countries, sending countries don't have embassies or are not very supportive. Virtual safe spaces are seen as also important, especially with, women who are in just only in the house. So getting them through radio, through mobile phones, and then awareness campaigns for employers have been widely used with mixed results. Some of them helped, some did not really. So an intervention which was really interesting, where domestic workers gifted a bag of dried mangoes to their employers and showed them a photograph of their families, really helped to humanize the domestic worker in the eyes of the employer and really create goodwill and reduce all sorts of violence by employers. Next, please. So then we come after return, and reintegration is one of the phases of migration that we saw is doesn't get as much attention in the research, but migrants do face several reintegration challenges, including not being able to find work or transfer their skills, and a lot of them do not have pension coverage or social protection when they return, as well as stigmatization, particularly with female migrants from South Asia. In India, for example, one key informant told us that often women have to go back to shelters or government houses instead of their homes because they may not be accepted in society due to societal norms. But of course, this has been changing a lot recently. Next, please.
A minute more.
Sure. So yes, I think COVID-19 exacerbated a lot of the vulnerabilities, and Joyce and Patrick talked about this before, so we may skip this one and talk about, important mechanisms that need to be talked about, like, having them have access to health insurance and vaccination and repatriation, and even just fighting stigma against them for being carriers of disease, etc. Okay, next, thank you. Okay, so in general, laws are there to be for fairness, for freedom, for making sure that migrants have a good journey. But in practice, really many of the policies and laws do not get implemented, and even bilateral agreements between sending and receiving countries. And so really there should be two things we will be looking at. That sending and receiving countries should be focused on. On the one hand, improving migration improving migrant women's access to information and legal assistance, but on the other hand, also applying stricter prosecution. So the focus is more generally on making migrants aware, helping them navigate through pitfalls and avoiding being trafficked rather than really prosecuting and criminalizing traffickers and setting harsh penalties. Next. So these are really, we're looking at systematic issues where the framework contributes to the vulnerability faced by migrant workers by giving employers and agencies disproportionate control over them. And so the big debate now and the big discussion is on, first, migrants should be recognized under the labor law to change this from the root, and that's unfortunately not the case yet. And so the big debate is now about, well, is the answer the abolishment of Cafla or not? And some countries are actually taking that into consideration now and introducing standardized contracts, where workers have more bargaining powers and are allowed to bring complaints to judicial authorities and etc. But really, it could be difficult to monitor those conditions, and the weak enforcement of contracts are a risk, and even the way that employers are not really aware of the Cafla institutions, it could contribute to lack of dramatic change if this really happens. And so next, so really what we're looking at is a situation where, with the exception of COVID times, potential migrants will continue to seek migration to the Middle East despite probable abuse and widespread deception in the hope of having positive experiences. So with all these mechanisms that have limited success and caveats for helping reduce vulnerability to forced labor, it seems that there is no single solution. But all intervention needs to work together. But the bigger thing is there is a systemic change that is needed. And I think that what it will really take is political will to cooperate between sending and receiving countries and to reform their policies and institutions and honor their agreements in order to make the priority to provide a safe and dignified journey for migrant workers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have just run over a bit, but yeah, so please, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, lots of interesting information you have provided, Hagar and Chloe. So keep those questions coming. You can put them in the chat, or, make a list of it so we can come back to the questions when the 4 papers are done. So thank you for that. So let's move on to the second paper. The second paper is by Dr. Shobita Digari, is from the University of Bournemouth, United Kingdom. And she is presenting on the topic of children at the margins, and intersectional analysis of anti-trafficking interventions in Nepal. Shobita, do you want to put up your slides? Yes, thank you for that. Yes, you have 15 minutes and I will give you a buzz, maybe perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before when your 15 minutes is up.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shobha. Thank you, fellow panelists. Hello, fellow panelists. Yeah, so today I'll be looking into my own research, my PhD research on child trafficking in Nepal. Basically, what I try to do in this paper is I argue for exploring an alternative narrative of vulnerabilities, trafficking vulnerabilities, focusing on resilience and agency, rather than just focusing on children as victims, because based on age. So I talk about intersections of gender, caste, and ethnicity, which leads on to vulnerability. Okay, let's move on. To begin with, I'll just provide a brief context. I'm sure we're all familiar with children's rights and how this framework is sort of used to understand trafficking interventions and applied in different contexts. I will briefly talk about childhood, different types of childhood in Nepal, because I think that's one of the main issues when we talk about intersectionality, which is often missing within the anti-trafficking responses in the context of Nepal. I briefly talk about intersectional framework, mapping the margins, and then go on to talk about my own research findings, fieldwork findings in terms of gap between policy and practice. And sort of what this paper, what I plan to do in this paper is how to, the broader questions around how anti-trafficking interventions, both policy and practice, can benefit from intersectional approach. Okay. So to give you a bit of context, in the dominant traffic narratives, of course, children are viewed as victims and vulnerable based on age. As we know, the trafficking protocol gives a special attention to children that is under the age of 18 are classed as children and are vulnerable to sort of our trafficking victims based on this unified notion, unified category of age between 0 to 18. So there's no sort of differentiation between, for example, 13 to 14 or 15, 16-year-old to 7, 8-year-old. And that makes a huge difference between when it comes to interventions and sort of focusing on different forms of vulnerability and in the process of victimization, which are often based on social categories. Of course, age is an important factor, but there's other social categories such as ethnicity, class, caste, which I will sort of discuss in my paper in showing the case of Nepal. So basically, O'Connell Davison, she argues that what this protocol does is children and the agency of children and young people in different contexts are beyond the purview of existing trafficking protocol. And so these understandings deviate from realities of victims' need, both socio and economic needs. And this is something I argue in my paper. And so basically what this paper is trying to do is to look into theorizing age divisions along with other social categories like which Allen and Thorne argue, for example, gender, various intersections children face. So a bit of more context when it comes to, of course, children's right is the UNCRC is a human rights framework for the protection of rights and dignity of children who've been trafficked or are vulnerable to trafficking. So this has sort of a universal adoption of children's right framework within different contexts, for example, Nepal. So we've ratified the convention and we've sort of built up those principles within our national laws and policies. But then there's been critique in different contexts. For example, how these universalized responses is sort of challenging in local context, and these have been questioned. And one of the main questions focuses around the notion of childhood and children's agency, especially in contexts such as conflict, for example, where like in Nepal, we have had conflict for the civil conflict for 10 years. So how does that sort of relate in those local contexts? Scholars have also questioned the notion of Western notion of childhood. I think that's one of the main debate. I won't talk a lot about the debate, but I can, if you have any questions, I can answer that later. So this focusing on the Western idea of childhood, that everybody goes to school, they are protected and so forth. But then in the context of, for example, Nepal, we don't have a welfare system, and government are less compliant to sort of understanding these vulnerabilities. So how does that work? The Western notion can apply in contexts such as in global South, and particularly in Nepal. Again, another debate is how I earlier mentioned about trafficking protocols sees children as a special case, but then there's debate that how that it sort of neglects children's agency, and that is important when we are sort of arguing, or we're sort of looking into interventions which focuses on children's agency. And I'll come back to that point where at sometimes it's extremely problematic when we ignore children's agency in contexts such as children working in different sectors as child labor or in other precarious sectors, when we ignore children's agency. Again, Hujuman argues that such views are built on this trafficking protocol are often built on the age of children, leave no room for children evolving capacities, and ignores other socio-cultural contexts and economic heterogeneity, which are hidden within the singular notion of child, that 0 to 18 category. Such views are built on this notion that age of children tend to marginalize other social categories, which I mentioned earlier, the intersectional categories such as caste, class, and ethnicity, which play a role in the process of victimization. And I think within this broader debate is this notion of childhood that I mentioned earlier, as to how the CRC often sees children as one singular childhood, right? So in Nepal, childhood can be this research suggesting that there's two different types of childhood. One is urban childhood and rural childhood. Rural childhood is again children who are often in out of school, or who work for the family in terms for sustainability. And then we have urban middle class childhood, which sort of focuses on the CRC notion, where they are protected, they go to school, and so there is this two different types of childhood in Nepal. But what I argue in this paper, there's more than these two notions of childhood, and it's more, so it's no longer a homogeneous category, and it's based on your gender, your economic status, your geographical location, or even your caste, which caste you belong to. So it's no, the experience of childhood is not a single experience, as to what often is assumed in the case, in many cases. So also it is important to understand the transition from childhood to adulthood is dependent on the status rather than the age. And this is something I argue in this paper as well. Okay, so a bit of research methods. So what I did is I did fieldwork in Nepal. Of course, I interviewed, semi-structured interviewed with government, NGOs, INGOs working on children's rights organizations, anti-trafficking interventions. I also interviewed anti-trafficking organizations, Shakti Samoa. If you're familiar with the organization, they were victims of trafficking themselves, so they've opened their own organization who are focusing on anti-trafficking interventions. So the findings are based on stakeholder interviews rather than interviewing children. Of course, again, to do with ethics and other reasons, I chose not to interview children. So the intersectional framework, basically I'm sort of drawing on Crenshaw's work and sort of focusing on how these various margins sort of reproduce vulnerability when it comes to children. And it's not just to do with age, but it's more to do with caste, ethnicity, and geography and their location. And how this core idea I draw on this way, this core idea of intersectional framework is to move beyond this unidimensional perspective, such as just focusing on gender in feminist studies, or focusing on age when it comes to childhood studies, but focusing on social inequality and injustice, which is seldom caused by one single factor, but by interactions of various categories of differences and power dynamics. And this is something I sort of draw on this paper. Again, the socioeconomic context in Nepal, Nepal is it's one of the oldest states, and there's been presentation on Nepal, so I'm sure you're familiar with Nepali context. Children, it's a country of young people, so 18 children, 50% of the population are young people below the age of 18. But what I sort of argue in this paper is that we need to put anti-traffic intervention within this broader context, within these intersectional challenges when it comes to addressing children's rights. For example, health is still problematic in the context of Nepal. Although it's compulsory for children to go to schools, but not many children in rural areas do not attend schools. Especially, it's again gendered construction, how this gender discrimination, where young girls are often, there's high cases of school dropout. Birth registration is still a problem in Nepal, although it's compulsory now for children to get birth registration, but it's still a problem where many children are unregistered, and also to do with this issue of citizenship in terms of whether a mother can apply citizenship for their child. So that has been an ongoing debate as well. Child labor, again, is a form of part of family support mainly in rural areas. Traditional practices such as child marriage, child labor, Chaubari Pratha is again, although it's abolished, but you still hear quite a bit in media, and children in institutional care is still seen as an issue. This is further exacerbated by natural disaster, 2015 earthquake, and now the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, leading to children's vulnerability. So again, what I found in my research was that child trafficking in Nepal, earlier child trafficking was, Nepal was a source country. Children were trafficked to India, mostly to India for forced labor or sexual exploitation. But now it's also become a transit country and destination country. And destination country for children from Bangladesh and India to embroidery factories. There's of course not enough data when it comes to how many children are trafficked, but then we often rely on the National Human Rights Report, which again, this dark figure of crime, so we don't know exactly how many children are trafficked every year. So the destinations have sort of moved on to newer destinations, such as Middle East, Africa, Korea, and China. What I found in my research was this cases of false marriages, mobile prostitution, where children are sort of placed, especially in border areas, where they're placed in certain places and then moved on to another place. So it's sort of called mobile prostitution, as also disguised as cultural troops. Mostly children are sort of promised as dancers, and then in that process they have been sort of exploited. Again, forced labor and intercountry adoption, which has been halted at the moment, but is still, there are cases on that as well. Along with cross-border trafficking, external trafficking has been a significant rise, but also within the country, they often, this is the area which is often ignored, and this is the focus of my paper and was part of my PhD as well. Children who are working are found in adult entertainment sector. There is a gray area, and this is where I talk about children's agency, as to how important it is to understand children's agency within the dominant trafficking discourse. Because often when I was interviewing, for example, police or government employers, they were arguing that children employed in adult entertainment sector are there with their own free will, but then there are cases of exploitation and abuse in the entertainment sector. So often they are unidentified, again to do with this dominant narrative of ideal victim, as to who do we see ideal victim, and this is very much focused in the Nepali context as well, which I'll talk about in my next slide. So while trafficking—
3 minutes, Pavita.
Okay, the sexual exploitation is still prominent, but there are other forms, like I've said earlier. So what I try to do, like I said, I talk about intersectionality. So I draw, in my research, I found about this sort of two forms of vulnerabilities. One is individual vulnerabilities based on gender, caste, and ethnicity. And then we have structural vulnerability, children who are working, migrant children, not just primary migrants, children are primary migrant themselves, but also secondary migrants. For example, some of my interviewees mentioned that children are, the entire family moved to India for work, and then once they reached India, family members are separated. Some are put in restaurants, some in exploited labor conditions. They are separated from their family. So it's not just children migrating, but also migrating with their parents, called secondary migration. Education, this is interesting because often we think, when we think of the dominant narrative, we think lack of education or illiteracy. That's what we often hear in the context of Nepal. But then some of my interviews mentioned that children who are in school were looking for opportunities. They are sort of well aware of opportunities. For example, I said earlier, in adult entertainment sectors. So they are looking for opportunities to work in cities. So it's not just lack of education, but sometimes they are aware of what they're getting into as well. So that was something some of my interviews mentioned. And this is again to do with the age factor, when we sort of place children between 0 to 18 categories, but there are young people between 16 to 18, which often find themselves having a sense of agency in terms of finding job, of looking for opportunity elsewhere. And again, lack of birth registration is something which sort of I highlight in my research. Okay, I need to end. So some of the gaps I've sort of identified in this paper and my research is that we have brilliant policies. We've sort of ratified all of the international conventions, regional conventions, and we've applied in laws and in practice. There are gaps, like earlier Hagar and Chloe mentioned, that there are gaps in practice. The dominant interventions when it comes to Nepal, anti-trafficking interventions, are the 3 Rs: the rescue, rehabilitation, reintegration, followed up by the 3 Ps: again, to do with the TIP report, trafficking person report, prevention, protection, prosecution. But what I argue in this paper is it's very narrow in terms of its framework, because we often focus on certain categories of victims. What I found often focus on cross-border trafficking rather than internal trafficking, because of the nature of who we see as victims and who we see as vulnerable. So this sort of 3R framework is extremely narrow, and it really does not look into from the intersectional vulnerabilities, which I've mentioned earlier. And therefore, I sort of, in this paper, I argue that child trafficking should be looked from intersectional approaches, both in policy, both in research as an analytical framework to recognize complex inequalities, social inequalities, as well as in policy and practice framework. And how is the benefit for this is sort of provide some suggestion is that there's a need to address the pre-existing issues of child survival, development, including child poverty, education, birth registration. These are broader issues around addressing children's rights. And so far, anti-trafficking interventions are focused on 3Rs, which are extreme, like I said, extremely narrow, to again bringing in this ideal victim narrative and the heroes and villains, and who do we respond to and who do we sort of ignore. Multi-agency partnership, again, is important, and using voice of survivors and victims to share resources and information and best practice is, again, another way forward. So I'll end the presentation there. I think I'm running out of time. If you have any questions, I can answer them later. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shobita. Again, a lot of rich information and in reference to children. It's so interesting. Our panel has got gender and child focus. So moving on to the third paper, we have Dr. Qureisha Dawood and Professor Mariam Sidat Khan. The topic of the paper is Enslavement and Bonded Labor, the Unforgiving Work Environment of Vulnerable Black African Women Domestic Workers in a Post-Apartheid South Africa. Professor Mariam Sidat Khan is from the UKZN University, and Dr. Qureisha Dawood from I think IIE Varsity College. Have I got it right? So thank you to
Yes,
both
that's
of you.
right.
Yeah, thank you. And over to you. You've got 15 minutes. Starts now.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to apologize in advance for my voice. I'm just getting over the flu. Okay, so basically our paper is going to look at the subjugation of Black women, particularly manifested through socialization and maintained through patriarchy, a legacy of apartheid, and ultimately domestic work in post-apartheid South Africa. So first I want to contextualize domestic work, and basically as it stands, we've got about 1 million domestic workers currently active in this sector, and it represents about 5.84% of the total South African labor force. Of course, we gauge that this might be more, as many of them are unregistered and active within homes in South Africa. But what is most poignant here is that 91% of these are Black African women, with about 9% being colored women. And colored in the context of South Africa means mixed race. We have to stress race in the South African context, as many authors do, as a form of oppression, particularly in the South African context. And race needs to be included in any theoretical analysis to sufficiently understand the nature of domestic work, particularly in South Africa. Okay, so within domestic work, we have to take into account apartheid, where Black women, particularly under apartheid, went through a kind of triple oppression. So they were Black, they were women, and economically, they really had to find some way of making money, either through manual labor, like working on mines, or finding domestic work, okay? So they worked for white landowners. There was no minimum wage. And so in this context, it was akin to slavery. There were job restrictions. So Black women could only work in certain jobs. They were marginalized to various geographical areas called Bantustans. They had Bantu education, which meant that they received sort of a minimum serving of education, whereas education that allowed you social mobility, like getting into university and things, were reserved for white people. And, you know, I know it's shocking to us today, but back then it was legalized. This kind of subjugation was legalized. And so women ultimately experienced this triple oppression. And so, yes, while there has been a move towards urban areas, and post 1994, we've seen many Black women take on positions and get into university. Ultimately, domestic work has continued to manifest itself as a Black woman's work, okay? So within the home, domestic work is ultimately invisible. And so domestic workers at the mercy of their employers who abuse them, exploit them, and there is no actual set of chores or job description. So they might do cleaning, cooking, childcare, elder care, pet care. They might live in with the employer or live out, which means they'll come in and work for a set period of time and then leave. But live-in work is more akin to slavery because they live under the conditions of the employer and are available 24 hours to that employer and have to eat what the employer allows them. Whether they can meet family is up to the employers. And this will become clearer towards the end of the presentation when we get into COVID-19 conditions. And so dirt is ultimately tied to those who clean it. And Perennius is one of those authors who has consistently written about the cycle of slavery and how Black women and women of color around the world have become enslaved, even though the word slavery, you know, we might not use the word slavery, but these elements of slavery still exist. And so even through discourse, through being through saying, oh, our maid or our helper is like family, it's ultimately not family. There's a fine line between like family and being family. Okay, so also there's a pseudo-maternalism. So madams, in this case, or the employers might say, oh, my helper is just like my daughter, or she treats my children just like she would treat her own children. Or they might say, she's just like my child. And so it's a very, it's sort of like infantilism that comes across and pseudo-maternalism. And in South Africa, with the rise of the Black middle class post-1994, there's also a gender dynamic that people have written about, where now you'll have a Black employer and a Black maid. And so there's a gender and race dynamic there, which seems to have crept into writings around domestic workers and their employers in recent work. And so there is no more the white madam and the Black maid. It's become more gray in terms of color dynamics. And so the Modern Day Slavery Act looks at servitude, slavery, child labor, but ultimately we're talking here about ownership of the domestic worker. Okay, and so we have the Domestic Workers Act, which says they shouldn't work more than 45 hours a week. There's provisions for unemployment insurance fund, but ultimately some money is better than no money. So a domestic worker will work over 45 hours or will allow herself to be owned and infantilized because of the risk of unemployment. Okay, so we've seen a survey from a company that has a platform that is sort of like they allow digital hiring of domestic workers. So in their survey, they found that 16% of domestic workers in South Africa had been verbally or physically abused. Despite this legislation, 62% were not registered for UIF. Domestic workers did not receive a pay slip, and only 15% received annual leave. And so within the employer's home, this is also echoed across the UK, where migrant workers who worked as domestic workers had their passports withheld, like Chloe and Hagar's presentation. Half of them suffered psychological abuse. Many of them suffered physical abuse, sexual abuse, and did not receive adequate meals. So basically, within the privacy of the employers' homes, many of them did not have their own room. Their working conditions were exploitative. They didn't have time off and received a weekly salary that was £50 or less. In South Africa, you can see that this is a stats essay graph that showed women are underrepresented in high-level roles, but you can see here, in 1995, 87.3% of domestic workers were women. And in 2018, it had jumped to 97%. So women are overrepresented in low-level domestic worker roles still. And this is because historically, Black women were socialized primarily within a patriarchal value system. And so they brought up in mainly rural areas to depend on men. They were brought up to do domestic tasks in preparation for work and marriage. And there's that transition from unpaid domestic labor in the home to bonded labor, dependent on low levels of skills and education. And so ultimately, they are secondarily socialized when they go into the home of their employer. They adopt the culture, norms, space, and place of her employer's home. And this is dependent on the religion of the employer, the dressing, the behaviors, how to mother her employer's children. And this feeds back into live-in versus live-out work. In work that we've done in our dissertations, Muslim women have employed domestic workers who dress modestly, who have worked for Muslim employers before, who can mother in a Muslim appropriate way. And so the domestic worker internalizes these cultures and norms and values. Theoretically, we've looked at Berger and Lachman, externalization, objectification, and internalization. And what are the girl-child's constraints that exist and are accepted and taken for granted? And so basically, domestic workers are socialized into realities that are manifested today. So while we have legislation and domestic worker protection, they are exposed to hazardous and toxic chemicals at work, chronic pain and injury, which are not protected by their employers, exposure to humiliating and increasingly sophisticated technologies of surveillance. So they might have cameras in the home, undernourishment and sleep deprivation for those who live in, and isolation and loneliness. And you'll see why we talk about that. Okay, we have a Domestic Workers Act, like I said.
Your 3 minutes, Qureisha.
Minimum wages, okay, and there are unions that do exist. But ultimately, the average South African salary is 22,500 Rand, but domestic workers earn 2,500 to 3,000 Rand. And you could see here that monthly basic expenses are more than what a domestic worker earns. And so under COVID, many of them, 2.2 million jobs were lost. Generally, 250,000 of these comprise domestic workers, and many of them were fired telephonically. They were not eligible for UIF and the temporary employer-employee relief grant, so they lost income completely. With level 3, they were allowed back to work, but they had to travel in full taxis because their only option is communal transport. So when they lost jobs, they still had to pay school fees. They still had to pay for data to allow their children to learn online. There was a rise in inflation. They still had to work for had to pay for sanitation products, with 90% of them being sole breadwinners. So there's a cycle of poverty and subjugation. And so we feel like there needs to be a clinical model that interrogates how Black African domestic workers are seen, what this means in a gendered and racial lens, and how do we deal with this in terms of socialization of patriarchy. So we need to look at key historical apartheid intersections, the human rights contraventions, because this is actually slavery, and a model that works as a form of finding out how we do this impartially with the state regulations, and who are the change agents that will look at the poor, vulnerable Black African woman and entrenched inequalities, which will address this and the protection of domestic workers in South Africa. Okay, that's it from me. I'm gonna stop sharing there.
Thank you, Qureisha. I was getting worried about your throat and voice. You know, you held up so well. Thank you so much. Lots of interesting information, you know, very much sociological in looking at the narratives of race, gender, class. So I'm sure there'll be questions, and already there are a few in the chat. So let's move on to the final paper. That's on excessive and hazardous child labor in Kenya, a multi-level analysis of a Kenyan household survey. Authored, the presenters are Wendy and Giuseppe, and I think is Kim involved as well, but I think they are the two main speakers for today.
Only two authors, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I think Giuseppe Mao would share his slides.
Sure, I'll share my screen. Bear with me. Let's see if I can do this. Almost there. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, we got that now.
Got 15 minutes. I'll give you a reminder when we have 3 minutes up. Yeah.
Thanks. Great. So thanks very much, Wendy. I'll kick this off and then hand over to you for the initial part, if that's okay. So Wendy and I are going to be presenting our work on excessive and hazardous child labor in Kenya, something we've been working on for the last year or so. First thing first, before we kick off, a brief outline of the presentation. We're gonna follow the structure of our paper. First, provide our hypothesis and theoretical standing, a little bit of background info on Kenya, some key definitions, and then data methodology results and conclusion. Okay. Wendy?
Yeah, so I'm going to present the couple of slides and then Giuseppe join back in again. Just confirm, can you hear me, Giuseppe?
Yeah, I can hear you very well, Wendy.
That's great. So there's some excellent papers in this area, and our paper uses data from 2015-16, while Krauss used a different data set. And Krauss's paper in Cambridge Journal of Economics is called a pluralist paper, and we highly appreciate this because he was saying the decisions that are made are not just decisions taken in the choice realm. They're actually conditioned on all these other situational facts like characteristics of the structure of the economy. And here we have not only the economic class structure, but the cultural influences in different areas. And some of these are disputed, so they're not clear. So there is some scope for choice. But what he's saying is that all the things listed here, and he includes demographic aspects, are structural. But actually, it's important to realize that within those, and even within demographic variables, some are economic and some are not economic. So in this paper, we decided to highlight the supra-economic aspects and variables, and to allow for education, for example, the education of the parent or female carer, and have that tested in the context of a model where we do allow for economic factors. Turn the slide. So that's sort of drawing on this important paper, but there are other good papers by Moyi, by Buchman. Gruffydd-Jones offers a really nice alternative to the standard economic narrative. So in economics, you have different schools, and we like this Gruffydd-Jones, who's saying the history really matters. And here for Kenya, you know, there are specific structures and institutions, and particularly industries, and their normative structure as well as organizational structure, which leads to the current contracting system, and then that leads toward the demand for child labor. So we've called that demand factors, and then it's quite common to then distinguish that from the household's situation, which might be called supply of labor factors. But it's not really sufficient, all these things. We have to also consider farming. We have to also consider the domestic work. And so this paper is focused on children maybe working too much and that being a source of harm. We have also allowed for hazardous forms of labor. And the domestic labor here is considered as hazardous because of the cleaning products, because of the risk and exposure. And so what we found, of course, was that mining and quarrying industries were a very high risk factor. But we'll give you the results later. Giuseppe is going to start, I think, now. Oh, no, we have here's another summary of the background, is just mentioning about Kenya's own economic structure. So you've got your coastal areas. It has a tourist industry. It has a lot of agricultural products, very rich port exporting economy and tourism. And then you have mining and quarrying industries in some other districts, and here they're called counties. And we have information on the counties. So we've been able to test for which is the area that has the highest risk for child labor after allowing for the household situation. And so we're allowing for all these different factors. So Giuseppe is going to run through the data and the methods used.
Thanks, Wendy. The first thing first, before moving on into the data, a couple of definitions, as Wendy mentioned. We are applying a twofold definition. So twofold definition of child labor, considering excessive and hazardous at the same time. The excessiveness thresholds are provided by ILO, so we consider children in labor, those aged 5 or 11 who worked at least 1 hour in the last week, or do 28 hours of household chores. We also consider children in labor, those aged 12, 14, who do work 14 hours a week, or carry out 28 hours of household chores. And finally, we consider child labor, those aged 15, 17, working 43 hours per week, or doing 28 hours of household chores. The hazardous side of our definition, again, we're borrowing from ILO and the US Bureau of International Labor Affairs, and we are considering these sectors to be hazardous. So if a child carries out at least 1 hour of work in the last week in any of these sectors, we are considering that as a form of hazardous child labor. And these are farming, herding, fishing, but also construction, mining and quarrying, harvesting, and domestic work, like Wendy mentioned, as well as transporting goods and people and scavenging and packing. With regards to the data, we are very fortunate to have the 2015-16 Kenyan integrated household budget survey, which we think is an incredibly good data source. The sampling frame for this is the same as the, it's called NASIP 5. It's the same sampling frame used for the census in Kenya. This study's been going on, this survey, it's a labor force survey, and it's been going on since the early 80s. It uses a twofold stratified sampling design, two-stage stratified sampling design. So every county of Kenya, this 47, is divided up into rural and urban. And then clusters are extracted from each one of this stratum, and then from those clusters, families and households, I should say, are randomly selected, standing equal chances of selection. And so we ended up with 25,000 households, 90,000 individuals in the survey, and from those we focused on everyone aged between 5 and 11. So we ended up with 35,000 respondents in our survey. So we use in our data, we use the KIHBS 2015-16 for individual and household level variables, and then we use the previous wave, 2005 and 6, for county level poverty rates. We used the basic education statistical booklet provided by UNICEF for the number of school teachers at the county level, and also the gross county product reports to get information on the sector-driven GDP contribution at the county level for mining and quarrying, construction, and agriculture. Notably, on the right, the weighted percentage of child labor is almost 8%. So it's quite high. One of the key variables that we used at the household level, the wealth asset variable. So we were looking at assets, and we used the variables like the roof material, the type of toilet to use, whether anyone in the household used mobile phones or tablets or computers, and then we built the factor using factor analysis, and then we ranked all the households and divided them up into quintiles from the very low wealth to the very high wealth. Okay, I'll now move on to results. Sorry. So we used to investigate the relations between individual, household, and county level variables, and our outcome variable, which is the number of children in labor. We used a nested Poisson multi-level regression model with a maximum likelihood estimation using our LME4, and we ended up with a three-level multi-level model with random intercept for county and age, and a random slope for a selected county variables. Notably, we've also used population count as an offset, and with computed weights, so all the results are weighted. Okay. A couple of key findings before I hand over to Wendy for the final slide on the policy conceptualization of these findings. And so we found that age matters a great deal, as we can see in comparison to age 5, as the child grows older, the likelihood of being in child labor, the level of children labor raises. And indeed, this indicates that specifically the age 5, the age 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, they're all strong positive association with child labor in comparison to age 5, indicating that there's quite a lot of small children enduring harm. Indeed, the wealth variable at the household level also mattering in comparison to the very low asset level. We see that medium and high are protective factors when it comes to child labor, so they're negatively associated with child labor. the religious ethnic group effect is small. As we can see, only other religion, which comprises all the other religions in Kenya, which aren't Muslim or Christian, is slightly related to child labor. But the parental education has quite a significant effect as a protective factor. So if the more educated is the female carer, the less likely to be in child labor. Finally, the regions do matter a great deal in Kenya, the counties, and in particular for mining and quarrying. We see that after controlling for all of these factors, we see some evidence that mining and quarrying is strongly associated significantly associated with child labor. And indeed, we can observe the variance partitioning coefficient, the VPC, and the three models will see that the variance attributable to the region, to the county level, kind of decreases as we added more factors. Wendy?
Yeah, so we are just ready to conclude, but I would point out that we have written a full paper, and there are a number of figures in the paper which are of very high quality, and they distinguish the gender differences by age group and sector and by different counties, and there are statistical boundaries of 95% confidence. And so the paper's, you know, quite in-depth and helpful if you wanted to target your efforts to reduce the child labor, but I'm not convinced about targeting being an outcome of these findings. So that's the sort of direction that the discussion is going. And we're not ready to share that paper, but I wanted to provide it to the conveners. So when we think about the supra-religious variables, you know, there was an ethnic effect. It was small. And I'll just tell you what it was, that it was that the non-Muslim, non-Christian groups were more likely to be in child labor. So what some people call, with regard to Kenya, as traditional or perhaps animistic religious group, that was where there was more child labor, after allowing for all these other factors, including rural. So we've written a discussion of some of these super economic factors, and really the gender issue is there. So gender itself is not significantly different, but it affects very much which sectors they're working in. And by including domestic labor, we have the girls showing up as in harmful child labor. But if you omitted domestic labor, then you wouldn't be noticing that as much, and it would be less than half as much child labor. So I think that's important. And then we can find, having allowed for both girls and boys and what they do, that under A1, children whose parent or female carer is having more education, then it's less likely that that child would be in child labor. And that is additional to any economic effects, which are also allowed for. So, you know, we think that's really important, but then how do you start to get these adult women to be educated? Household size is positively associated with more child labor, but I think this has to be seen in terms of farming and the sharing of labor in informal enterprises, where there's no demand and supply. So while some of our discussion is about demand for labor and supply of labor, they're not really distinct when there's a household enterprise, and livestock is included there. So I'm not surprised by that finding, but the paper is about harmful amounts and forms of child labor. So it is a worry that the larger households have these children in harmful forms of child labor. Coming to B, the policy implications of these super economic variables. You know, having allowed for wealth and poverty, we can't afford to wait for some trickle-down solution. So looking at B2, we think that it's good to not just look to government itself or a top-down solution from government, and certainly not to look at criminalization solutions, but to look at socially networked officials. And what they've done in Nepal is a bit different from Kenya. In Nepal, they have joined up training in recent years, and joining up the people from the education sector, social work sector, child care sectors, which is a growing sector, and also the officials responsible for labor. So by joining that up,
Wendy. Sorry,
Sure.
you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Then you start to minimize the role of the police, and you're bringing the police into the room with the joined up training and the campaigners, and forcing a conversation that understands more about children, about the fact that children have agency, about the fact that children are, you know, perceived as helpers, and they can't just be banned from helping their families. That's not the way to change things. It has to be changed through perceiving that it's not appropriate, and developing a sense of what is the appropriate way for children to work, which is to work less and to work in suitable roles. So we think that it wouldn't be reasonable to think of targeting the mining and quarrying districts. You know, that just pinpoints and sort of highlights a criticism of an industry or a district, whereas really the domestic labor and the farming indicates that it's quite widespread, and perhaps the solutions also need to be widespread. And that gets that conversation going about what is a good childhood and what is a good way of parenting children in low-income families. But we did find that it was the marginalized families that were having more child labor. So I hope that's helpful, and I thank all our, you know, helpful collaborators at our institutions. It was trilateral research that gave Giuseppe support and time and software, and now he works for Impact Cubed. Whereas, can you just turn the slide, please, to the last slide? Whereas I'm working at University of Manchester, who kindly support this research. And the software actually is free. We're using our software now. Yeah, so we've cited those key documents, and there's our email addresses. So, you know, please get in touch if we can do any services for you or get involved in campaigning. Let us know. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Well timed. So we have some time for discussion, and I see that we already have a couple of observations, discussions going on in the chat, and thank you for that. So if you want, you can switch on your cameras. Let's see whether we can have a discussion going. So I'm not sure whether we have any questions directly to any of the speakers. So is anyone here who want to start off? Can I take a question from someone?
Yes, it's Patrick. Can you hear me?
Yes. Do you want to introduce yourself and direct the question to the
Patrick Kilby from the
speaker?
Australian National University. I'd just like to ask Wendy and Giuseppe, this definition of dangerous child labour, you've listed herding of livestock. I was herding livestock at the age of 15. I never thought it was dangerous. And if you ask any kid in Kenya who's herding livestock at the age of 15, they won't see it as dangerous. So who comes up with these definitions?
Giuseppe is going to answer that.
Yeah, so we've reviewed quite a few documents, and there is a consensus between ILO and also the document that we reviewed in particular, this one by US Bureau of Labor. They've cited a few government pieces of legislation that also sort of agree with that definition. So I think you know, you're raising a really good point. De facto might be fine, but the jure there are lists saying that you shouldn't really be doing it. So we get your point.
We like to also hear from others in the room about this.
But yeah, it's a really good point, Patrick. It does make sense. It does make sense.
So I'm interested to hear from others in the room. I mean, I don't agree with Giuseppe, and we could discuss this point, because in a way, the subjective views of the children is a view that I would question in this instance. So it's the same with domestic work. And now Giuseppe has worked from a source, a specific written source. So we're trying to do evidence-based research here. And his source here is the US government source that was cited on the slide. And you know, it's not that I believe that or think that's true or right. We're saying if you allow for herding and domestic work to be considered as hazardous, as is normal in that source, then you get these results. The US has been computing the child labor percentages for different countries in its annual country reports on modern slavery for years and years. And these are the definitions that they're using. So to me, they're one of the voices in the room. I'm not saying they're objectively correct. I'm saying that is an important voice in the room. I noticed that on our slide about the time thresholds, we had two voices in that room because it says it's the ILO system, but ILO doesn't accept domestic work in setting up these time thresholds. It can't, because domestic work isn't in the GDP calculations. And so it's then, on the other hand, it's citing the UNICEF as our source, a written evidence source for, you know, what they think the time thresholds should be, including domestic work. So there are these debates between different stakeholders, and children are a stakeholder and their parents are. So what I pick up from Patrick is, well, they all think that's perfectly safe, but international institutions don't think that's a safe activity. And what worries me a lot is, on the one hand, we don't want to see children as victims and silence them, right? And so we do want to hear their voice in some room about this. So there should be a Kenyan discussion around what's the harmful list. But on the other hand, I'm not convinced that teenagers know what is the best long-term thing for them to do in a given month, because they can't perceive the long term in the same way that other older people can perceive that. They don't have the information. They haven't had the understanding and the life experience to see it. So there are limitations to the knowledge that kids have about what is safe. What I would say is the simple solution in Kenya is that, you know, limited amounts of herding are okay. Limited amounts of domestic work are okay. It's, you know, I would go along with saying it's not intrinsically a super dangerous occupation, but that what's happening here is there are lots and lots of hours being worked.
I think you raised the point about domestic work, you know, and I just wanted to add to that, saying that, you know, if every child or girl child in domestic work is subject to hazard, you know, be it working with firewood or with knives, you know, cutting vegetables, you know. So the level of hazards within the domestic sphere is so great and so dangerous for the child. And we know that many girls, you know, enter the kitchen and domestic work at a very young age. So again, we should come up with, you know, culturally appropriate but economic definitions of all forms of work.
If I can just add, I agree with Wendy. It's actually the number of hours, it's not the work. So I went to school and all sorts of stuff, but I still herded livestock. But I've come across in a project in Zambia where an agency, it was a child sponsorship agency, I won't name it, was not funding it because the boys were out herding cattle. And the local NGO was quite upset by that, because they said, well, you're denying these kids education effectively. And so you end up using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The issue isn't whether herding livestock's inherently dangerous. It can be, but usually kids are smart enough to avoid the danger. What the danger is, they miss out on education and hours and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we'll try and clarify and just check on this point in this paper, because sometimes what happens is triangular, that the person says, well, either they're in hazardous industries or they're doing excess time, and either of those is sufficient for them to be in harmful forms of labor. That is the ILO approach, but the ILO don't allow domestic work. But I think our approach here was to include the work and then set the time threshold. We can clarify it.
Shall we go to another question? I think there was one in the chat about live-in domestic workers. Hagar, was that a question that you raised or an observation?
Yeah, no, I just had the.
I can respond to that.
Sure.
So in South Africa,
should we say the question? Should I just read out the question? It's about if live-in domestic workers did better than live-outs, you know?
Yeah. So okay. Yeah, I read the question. So the challenge here is, and we're seeing particularly a challenge with the frontline workers. You have a select few domestic workers who are treated very well by their employers. They live in, they have great living conditions, they have great benefits, you know, very few, like medical aid access, private healthcare access, but those are very limited. The challenge that we're identifying in the lockdown is that domestic workers, some domestic workers have not seen their children and their families since lockdown because of the risk that they the perceived risk of that they would bring into the household. Then on the other hand, you have healthcare workers who have, you know, arrange regular testing for their housekeepers or domestic workers and have access to vaccines because they are considered frontline workers in, you know, working for healthcare workers. So it's very complex, but one of the huge challenges, our domestic workers, while you have them of all race groups in South Africa, they're largely Black African women. Several of the studies, recent studies, are showing that the worst employees are Black African women themselves, and the levels of exploitation are horrific. You know, engaging with domestic workers, you hear that quite often. I've heard domestic workers say they'd rather not work. The other thing is what we're seeing, and Qurecia used statistics from HEAPS. Well done, Qurecia. You did a great job of presenting, even though you had a difficult voice. Uberization. So people are using it, and it's the younger generation. Now, a domestic worker, for a domestic worker to get paid 250 Rand a day is you know, it's unusual, right? So somebody that comes in for the day, that is, that would be, let's just say that's the going rate right now. So with Uberization of domestic work, I think it's far more expensive. And who's using it is, I'll be honest with you, my son's away at university, right? And if they need to use help to have their place clean, they would use it. But here's the challenge. The challenge is you have to identify the number of rooms and the tasks that you require. And let's say the cost is, let's call it 50 pounds for argument's sake. The domestic worker gets 25% of that amount. So there's two reasons that people use it. One is because they're new to a place and they can't have access to full-time or child workers. So university students moving to a new city, people that do not have formal, you know, do not have domestic services, or people that do not want to have that personal relationship, because it is a personal relationship. The way it works in South Africa, and I'll very quickly, I'll sum up because I know Shoba wants to go. You know, it used to be a male-dominated sector, right? And Black African males lived in this, took care of families, cleaned homes, and in very kind of colonial setups, you still see that. And then we had the fear of sexual assault and so on and so forth. So it moved right to African women. And of course, the migrant labor supported or provided the source of domestic labor. But it's very complex. It's still extremely exploitative. Qurecia mentioned something about food. You know, the domestic workers have to eat what their employers tell them to eat or what they provide, if they provide food. And it's mandatory if they live in. And it's horrific, the kind of things that you see. I mean, you know, the stuff you don't finish on your dinner plate that you might throw down the garbage disposal are the kinds of food that domestic workers are often expected. And I just want to say one more thing, because we're looking at migrants and domestic workers. To the horror of my sons, I've discovered TikTok only because somebody sent me a video, and there's a woman on TikTok who is a domestic worker in Kuwait. She's from Africa, and she does these videos, and she really talks about the challenges of what she's allowed to do and what she's not allowed to do as a domestic worker. It's absolutely horrific. We have lots of work to do. Thank you. Well done, Gracia, and well done. Great paper.
Thank you.
If you don't mind me jumping in, I have a question for you, Miriam and Risha. Thank you. This was a really great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. My first observation is that as a South African, I was very surprised to hear how many live-in domestic workers you found. I wasn't aware of, I guess in the Cape Town context, it must be a little bit more rare. I haven't come across it. But what I really wanted to ask about is for South African women who work as domestic workers, the solutions are, I mean, a little bit more simple in terms of encouraging employers to provide proper benefits and clear job descriptions and pay slips and UIF and compensation fund subscriptions. My question was for the huge amount of women that are refugees in South Africa, and as we know, often are undocumented, given the huge challenges with keeping your documents up to date at Home Affairs, and therefore aren't able to, you know, get a bank account, register for UIF, register for medical aid. What would you suggest would be the solutions for these women?
So I think it's a responsibility of an employer. We as employees of universities, it's not our responsibility to register ourselves as SARS. And the challenge is because of the isolation and the nature of domestic work. There's nobody knocking on my door or Kuresh's door to say, is your domestic worker registered? How much do you pay her? Does she receive a bonus? You know, do you have some sort of savings or pension fund for her? There's no one checking. It's a matter of conscience. And I want to just relate a kind of personal story. So when the lockdown in South Africa started, I have a live-in domestic worker, and she has a daughter who's just finished high school last year, and her daughter lives with her. And so when the lockdown started, I started noticing that there was a huge price increase for basic supplies like rice and oil and milk and bread, and you know, so and we're a dual income home to professionals, and I found a significant kind of rise in price, and I couldn't understand why. Maybe it was because of the online shopping, but we saw that the inflation just soared all over the world, you know, with price fixing of basic supplies. So in that context, I was required to now output more to sustain my household, which is no different for my housekeeper, who has to sustain not only herself, but, you know, this whole notion of black tax. So there's other family members, cousins, relatives, and so on and so forth. So logically, it made sense to provide a inflation increase, or what I call a COVID increase, because the price is similar for her and me. It's not, it doesn't change for domestic workers, you know. So, but you have to conscientize yourself for that. So if you don't care, and one of the things that strikes me about interviews, you know, so on average, a living domestic worker should be earning about 6,000 rands a month. I'm not sure what that is in dollars or euros, but they don't. So we have, very much like you have, Woolworths there, which is obscenely expensive in South Africa. And they have fresh fruit and produce. And it's not uncommon to make a trip to Woolworths and spend 1,000 rand. So if you're paying the salary you should be, one shopping trip to last you a couple of days could cost you 1/6 of what you're paying your domestic worker. But the tragedy is that in these middle-class households, the average rate is about 2,500 to 3,000 for full-time living. And so there's huge complexities, because imagine you're madam, which is what they refer to here, it can go out in one morning and spend your entire salary, you know. So there's huge contestations but because it's so kind of ingrained, apartheid and inequality and exploitation it's institutionalized. I mean, our founding father of apartheid, Verwoerd, said, you know, don't teach them math and science, prepare them for the garden and the house. So it's it's embedded, you know, it's systemic and ingrained, and unless we question it, we have problems. Sorry, Shobha.
Yeah, I know. I'm just wondering if anyone else has any questions for other speakers, because, you know, we are running close to the finish time, and I'm sure, you know, the IT staff will close the room, you know, very quickly. So is there any questions for any of the other speakers?
Hi, Shobha. It's Wendy here. I had a question about causality for our speaker on South Africa, and it was I wrote it into the Q&A, and it was just there was a slide at the very end. It said lead to or lend to, and suddenly I couldn't understand what was causal.
Yeah, I think it was just hold on. I can't locate it.
Okay, let me try and open the slide. Kuresha, do you have the slide?
Yes,
open?
It says, can you clarify the causality? Is that causality on the final slide? Does it say lead to or lend to, and which condition could be changed?
Okay, let me see. The last slide. We're looking at the last slide, right? Is that the last slide?
Yeah, that's what Wendy is.
Yes, that's the one, lending to it. I think it says lending to.
I think that's an error.
That's
leading. So it's leading to.
Yeah. Sorry.
But I was thinking poor education of the second generation. Is it the child?
Are you looking at the second one or the third one? The model, therefore, change agent.
First one.
Okay. Lending to. Oh, yeah. So domestic work is a form of bonded labor, pervasive lending to. So no, actually, it's lending to because of the whole socialization process, right? So young girls are socialized into roles for marriage, and my PhD focused specifically on that. And the challenge here is, so when you ask them, so why did you become a domestic worker? I think 90% of the responses I received at the time said, I was not fortunate enough to get married. So getting married is considered good fortune. And then the other thing is when husbands die, abandon, disability, or something. It's so patriarchal in nature that women are taught to, kids are taught, girl child are socialized into home care from the time they're little. And then there's more investment in the boy child for education because they believe the girl child goes to enrich the family that she will marry into. So they have no skills at that stage. The only skills that they have is the ones they were socialized into. So they are forced to now support their families or themselves. And this is one of the few easily accessible, although highly exploitative, easily accessible choices for them. I hope that clarifies that.
Any questions? I just wanted I know that, you know, we are running short of time. An observation from both, you know, Shovita's paper and the paper Haggers and Chloe's, you know, I mean, what actually works? You know, we know the vulnerability, we know the limitations of, you know, the interventions that's put in place. Are there practices or anything that works to reduce the vulnerability? You know, it's also to do with cultural factors, you know, I mean, in India, for example, you have a number of domestic workers who go to Gulf, and you know there is different modes of exploitation that happens there as well. So I'm just, you know, I'm thinking, just, you know, as a kind of roundup as well, you know, to hear from you, to think about, or what would be your suggestions for something that works?
Would you like to go first? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really, interesting and difficult question, I think. So this is the thing with academia, right? We always critique the interventions are not working, and then we never come up with solutions. I think that's what every time you come up with. So I think what I found is, like, I think earlier Wendy mentioned about bottom-up approach, because I pretty much focus on cultural relativism and how I see it is so distant. The interventions are so distant to local realities. Like, for example, some of the things that are really working in Nepal were talking to religious leaders, for example, on awareness campaigns, talking to women's group who were focusing on raising campaigns around safer migration, for example. So these bottom-up approaches are often missing when it comes to intervention. We often focus on top-down approaches by having these policies and then figuring out from there and giving this money. And often, in case of Nepal, we heavily rely on USAID funding. So it's always donor driven. So what donor gives you, and this is the intervention, we have this much money, so rehabilitate these amount of women or children. So that's how it works in Nepali context. But then I think it's never working. It's always around the circle. We're reproducing the problem rather than focusing on the root causes. For example, focusing on labor exploitation, better working conditions in, for example, adult entertainment sectors. So there's various ways where we can sort of look from a bottom-up approach, and I think that is something I would
Thank you. Haga?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Shavita for sure. Things that are really bottom up. When it comes to any of those mechanisms, so if we're looking at trainings, for example, then how do we make sure that it's really relevant by looking at women migrants being the ones to actually give that kind of input, the ones who really lived this, the ones who know what works and what doesn't work and what the reality is according to what they experienced. I think we know that some things don't work, but the things that work, there have been limited evidence for it just because of the nature of the studies. But I think that the most important thing is to always look back at what the experience has been. And every stage will have a different thing to focus on. So the pre-departure with like making sure that they're connected. I think that in our case, the isolation or the risk of isolation is a big one, because of the nature of the work and living conditions. So anything that supports migrants in finding their networks and feeling connected, and knowing the information that they need on the one hand, but at the end, I think the issue is more systemic, and it would need more than that. But that's, I think, important just for their own empowerment and positive experience. And a lot of these people are I mean, it's this going back to this idea of like, are they victims or heroes? And it's not one or the other, it's both together. And we should definitely incorporate their experiences in whatever we look at for answers.
Thank you. I know that's a difficult one.
Yeah,
I know it's a difficult one.
but
it's just that, we problematize it, and this is a global challenge, isn't it? Migration is on the increase and the forms of it, and we do need good examples of how do we, encourage healthy, safe levels of migration, especially for women, and groups that we identify as victims.
Yeah, some of my paper co-authors are here if they would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes, and I just thought I'd use this to speak about, plans for publication, and Wendy can chip in as well. I think there are two issues here. One is the disciplinary, interests and backgrounds, but I think the wider remit about how we look at forms and nature of exploitative work practices, be it through the sectoral or social group experiences, is interesting. And we wanted to capture that as kind of a special issue in one of the possible journals. And we have a number of disciplines that, all our speakers have come from, so we would want to capture that. So we had identified a couple of journals, but again, there are a number of other panels. I think Wendy's organizing a similar panel in EID until, and then we could open it up to see whether we can get a number of papers relevant to the theme. But journals like perhaps Journal of Developing Areas or Global Studies, Global Labor Journal, that's something that perhaps would speak to all, all the disciplines that we are hearing from yesterday and today. So if you have any suggestions as well, we are open to that. But what we hope is that after this next week, we will, send out an email explaining our plans. And I don't know what your plans are. For example, some of the papers are written in progress. Some of you had written to say that, please do not circulate, so I know it's in draft form, so you might have other publishing plans as well, so do let us know what your preferences are so that we know that, whether to include you or not in the list. And if these two journals suit your plans as well, please let us know. There will be an email sent out perhaps next week to ensure, we include the possible journal names and the putting out a special issue based on at least 7 to 8 papers that we have received so far. So
can I make a suggestion?
Yes, Patrick. Yeah.
With a massive conflict of interest, I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Development in Practice, and we're furiously looking for special issues. And Joyce is a co-editor. So it's a big conflict of interest, but we just put it on the table.
I'd like to also make a comment about this, if I may. Thank you so much, Patrick. I think it's good that you said that. We hadn't realized that you were in that role. And I just left the editorial board of another journal. And what happened while I was on that board, I think I was there 6 years or something, was I began to realize that the conflict of interest issue is not so bad as it seems. So I used to be very cautious and also very sort of rarefied almost, like super cautious, not to publish in the journal that I was editing. But it's because the journal editorial boards are large, the editors can, withdraw from all the consideration of a paper. And what I've begun to realize is if we have some good material, and it doesn't really matter that we're on that editorial board, because I guess it's like in politics, it matters if it appears to be a conflict of interest, but we're not in politics here. We're in the publishing industry, and we're just trying to disseminate. I discovered that some journal articles don't get any citations. So after going through all the effort to get the acceptance and then the proofreading and then the release and online and paper versions, then nobody's citing those articles. And I was really surprised. And I believe as an editor or as an author, the main thing is to make sure we get people to use these findings. So it's whatever fits for getting it out in the internet, and then using that in social media, in networks, in user groups, stakeholder groups, in discussions about donor criteria. We've got to get into these rooms and say, oh, but there's already some evidence about that. So I think we shouldn't be too overly cautious about those possible conflicts.
Yeah, I wasn't being particular. I was being more ironic. And we actually talked about this even among the editorial board, and we worked out there are ways, even as us on the board directly, the editors themselves, to make sure that we can keep out of each other's way, to ensure that we don't influence refereeing and that sort of stuff. But certainly happy to throw Development in Practice in the ring for a special issue on migration.
Thank you. I think that will be very useful. Particularly, I think what I'm interested to is looking at, from a policy perspective,
Yeah, that's
Because
right. I think
many
the
of the
policy
papers,
angle really came out today.
in all the papers that we have been listening to yesterday and today, lots of policy angles. The paper doesn't have to be completely focused on policy, but the findings, how it can be converted or be of interest to policy. So something that that would tie in or perhaps interest journals such that Patrick has mentioned is developmental practice, isn't it? Would be the policy element of such forms of work practices, regimes, on social groups, and that those kind of things. So that's my initial thought after going through all the papers and the presentations and listening to you all. It has been fantastic. So perhaps we have a kind of a policy edge there, and we might.
Can I thank everybody? It's really timely now just to say thanks for all your hard work and the wonderful presentations and papers. The research looks really in depth. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
I have to thank Shovita, and she just had a baby. It's 2 weeks, and you could see, she's got the baby in the lap and, changing hands. So, hats off to you, Shovita, for presenting and, being in yesterday and today. And, it's not an easy job, as we all know. So thank you for that. But I want to thank again, as Wendy said, to all the speakers. You've been engaged right from the start. It's been a couple of months, isn't it, since we've been in communication. So being patient, and responding to emails, turning up for the rehearsal, sending in your papers, sending in your presentations beforehand. And thank you to the IT team, because, we went forward yesterday and today without a glitch. Yesterday was more of a time challenge, but we learned from that. And today has been much better. So as a team, we all work together. Thank you so much to Wendy for helping put this together, and to Mariam, who's been an excellent chair over yesterday and today. So yes, so we will be in touch. I hope you go on to enjoy the rest of the conference, and take care and have a good summer or a break wherever you are.